Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Engin Isin. I'm an international professor of international politics here at Queen Mary University of London. It's lovely to see many of you joining us. Today's seminar, these are mobile people seminars. Mobile People is a Leverhulme Trust and Queen Mary organized doctoral training program. It has 21 PhD students. Mostly we work on various matters of politics of mobility, migration, refugees, and so on. I'm delighted to host you today for Technologies of Expulsion, and with Martina Tazzioli, who has made major contributions. She is a lecturer at Politics Department in Goldsmiths University of London. She has made major contributions to broadly speaking, critical migration studies, touching on critical refugee studies, critical citizenship studies, critical mobility studies. She has a very strong track record of field work, from the mountains to the sea, and inside the dashboards, dashboards, control centers of Frontex. I particularly been following Martina's work because it is not only critically interventionist, but also her work straddles various disciplines, but specifically ways of thinking about the question of migration. Her book, especially Making of Migration and Making of Migrants, you'll be familiar with. Those of you who were with you last week when we were discussing her co-authored paper with Stefan Schiel, the very idea of the migrant subjectivity is produced through political discourse, and political practice is quite key to her work. Today, she's going to share with us a work that is not yet published. She's currently working. I believe it is part of a new book she is writing. So we are absolutely delighted to welcome Martina to Queen Mary virtually, but certainly very warmly. It's yours, Martina.
Thank you very much, Engin, for the generous introduction. And I'm very delighted to present this ongoing work today. Let me open my presentation. So, as Engin said, this is this work that I present today is an unpublished paper that I circulated. I don't know if you have circulated to the people who attended the seminar today. So if they've already read the paper or not. No, I'm wondering. Yes, okay, great. So now, just to have an idea. So there is this article that you have seen that is also situated in a broader research project, which is part of my new book manuscript entitled Border Abolitionism, Migration Containment and the Memory of Struggle and Rescue, that I'm currently working on. And I'm also developing a similar paper provisionally entitled Counter-Mapping the Techno-Hype in Migration Research, so that engage with a similar topic to the one that I present today. So given that you have, I take for granted that most of you have read the paper, I think might be boring for, just to summarize the paper. So I will try, as Engin suggested, to highlight the main contribution, but also the research question that animates this paper. So the idea behind this behind this paper and this work more broadly is, if you wanted, well, there is of course a growing literature, growing scholarship, interdisciplinary literature actually in migration studies, but also in critical security studies, and in partly also in geography that is investigated the function of digital technologies and biometric technologies in refugee and migration governance. So definitely not speaking about anything new. But for me, there is a sort of like impasse at the moment in this literature, which is mainly characterized by the presentism that underpins this research. So the idea that nowadays migration governmentality is fundamentally technological, and that this was not the case before. And there is this tendency to be subjected to boost, this techno hype, right? So to endorse to some extent the same narrative proposed by both state and non-state actors, also international agencies such as UNHCR, that technology will allow actors to govern migrants in a smoother way, so that the problem becomes only to what extent and what are the limits of like using technology, where shall we stop in order not to violate migrant rights and in order not to increase the risk of surveillance in camps, for instance. And of course, I don't want to downplay these concerns. My point is rather that there are two parallel streams of research. One that, as I just described, investigate the functioning of technology in refugee and migration governmentality at large, and that tend to take for granted what are the concerns and the problems and the object to be investigated, such as surveillance, privacy, and control. And on the other, there is a stream of literature that look at the same spaces, like the same refugee camps, for instance. And I will illustrate this in particular with reference to the Greek refugee context, that investigate instead how migrants are increasingly subjected to carceral geographies and mechanisms of confinement that are not narrow to detention per se. And so there is a need, in my view, of like making these two literature interact, not just to fill in a gap in the scholarship, but to investigate how carceral mechanisms and modes of confinement have been transformed in part due to the systematic implementation of technology, and how these digital technologies do not work in an empty or smooth space, but both the way in which migrants are controlled through technology and the mechanism of data and value extraction that takes place are grounded in carceral spaces. And again, this is particularly the case of the Greek context. So if you want, the first question can be summarized as how have carceral mechanisms been enforced, transformed, and enhanced through technology. Second, and relatedly, research on technology and migration tend to reproduce, as I said, what as described in the paper, Foucault has defined as a repressive hypothesis. That is the idea according to which power mainly works through repression and interdiction. So the idea that there are these pervasive forms of control and monitoring that stem from the use of technology in refugee camp as well as at the border. For instance, now in Greece, the Greek authorities, with the support of the European Commission, have opened new closed camps on some islands, in particular on the island of Samos and Lesbos. And the main concern raised both by scholars and by NGOs is related to the rise of technologized surveillance and the implementation of CCTV cameras and this centralized monitoring room based in Athens that is connected to this camp. So the second question is, what else, apart from surveilling and monitoring, do technology produce in terms of modes of value and subjectivity production? And what happens if we put at the core not surveillance, data privacy, and bias, but what migrants feel harmed by? So as I already mentioned before, the point here is not to dismiss, to downplay the risk of surveillance that is connected to the use of technology, but not to take for granted that is the main concern of refugees themselves, and is not even the main way in which and the main reason why these technologies are implemented. So if we shift the starting point towards how do migrants are harmed by this technology, which kind of harm is generated, instead of taking for granted the modes of violence that are generated through this technology. So the point of this paper is to interrogate what happens alongside and beyond repression, control, and surveillance. And this is also a way for in my opinion, to move beyond what I call the techno-hype in migration research and the risk of presentism. And I will also discuss in the conclusion these 2 points a bit more, because they're related to this second paper that I'm currently writing. So what is this techno-hype, which is connected also to this overstatement of the functioning and the presence of technology, and the fact that technology works smoothly. So more broadly, and this is the third research question, this paper asks how to come to grips with the political economic transformation engendered by digital technology, while at the same time not overshadowing a critique of the border regime. So this is if you want, the more political concern of the paper, that this exclusive attention to technologies as increasingly overshadow the focus on a critique of the border regime. So what does it mean to elaborate, to craft a critique of the border regime and of racialized bordering mechanisms in the present, and also by starting from the assumption that technology increasingly play a role in the functioning of the border regime, but that the problem are not, of course, technologies per se. For instance, I will speak now briefly about the Greek asylum context. So the problem of technology in the Greek asylum context is not technologies, but is how the asylum system in Greece is structured in a fundamentally exclusionary way. So methodologically, this entails first reversing the gaze by stopping seeing like a state and starting to inquire what does it mean to see technology as a migrant. See, this might be like a very maybe is too simple to put in these terms, because who is a migrant? Of course, we cannot reduce the multiplicity and the heterogeneity of migrants' condition to a single category. But the point is problematizing how do migrants see technologies, and what is the main harm caused to them, and how do which kind of struggles do they engage with in relation to technology. So seeing like a migrant is not conceived in the paper in abstract terms as an ideal positionality, but as an analytical gaze that pays attention to the claims that migrants raise for and against technology, and that is grounded in the materiality of their struggle for movement. In Dark Matters Under Surveillance of Blackness, Simon Brown claims that is at the border, territorial, epidermal, and digital, a site where certain bodies are cast out and made out of place, that a critical biometric consciousness can be realized. Such a methodological gesture inspires this paper, which, echoing scholarly intervention that call for going beyond the data-centric and individual consent framework, aims at unsettling a citizen view on digital technology. And by citizen view on digital technology, I mean as a critical analysis that starts from the assumption that the key concern of the implementation of technology migration governmentality are basically surveillance, data extraction, data privacy, and control. So in the paper, as for you have read it, but just to summarize, this is the main point. I introduced the concept of technology of expulsion to highlight that technologies, at least in particular in the field of asylum, are mainly used for obstructing, hampering, and keeping out migrants from asylum, rights, and financial or humanitarian support. So as far as the politics of asylum is concerned, this variety of technology are used to hamper migrants' access to the asylum procedure and to further delay and disrupt their possibility of obtaining the refugee status. So this is the way in which I conceive expulsion. Preventive expulsion or expulsion after that they manage to lodge their asylum application. There are other steps, such as, for instance, getting access to financial support. So in the paper, I draw on Saskia Sassen's conceptualization of expulsion and conceive it as the preventive or actual removal of some people from life project and livelihoods. So conceiving this way, technology of expulsion are by far not limited to spatial removal from a certain territories, but they also encompass technologies that hinder migrants' access to rights and asylum. Articulating debates on carcerality with Jasbir Puar's work on the politics of maiming, I contend that carceral mechanisms enforced beyond detention and beyond surveillance are quite prominent nowadays. And this consists in the active spatial harassment and stealing of migrants' time. The use of technology in refugee governmentality contributes to enforce modes of carcerality and confinement that work by choking and disrupting migrant lives. So it's not just about enforcing modes of surveillance at a distance, remote control. Of course, this is also the case. But if we go and see what is going on the ground, and I will speak about a couple of refugee camps in Greece, how this carcerality is enforced is less through detention and fixation in space that by choking and disrupting migrant lives and basically taking them to remote areas where even if they are in principle free to move, there is nothing they can do in those spaces. So they are in the middle of nowhere. It's important to clarify that when I refer to technology, and this is a point that I develop in particular in this other paper, Countermapping Technohype, what I have in mind are not just technology that fall under the label of the high tech. And actually, I think it's very important to bear in mind that migration governance is a field where is quite common to see the entanglement, the assemblage of, on the one hand, digital and non-digital technologies. So the persistence of the non-digital is still very important. And now this is entangled with the partial digitalization, but also high-tech and low-tech technologies. So if you want, the question is also, what is technology in migration governmentality? And for this reason, in this paper and in my work, I build on the work of some historian, for instance, the great book by Adam McKeown, The Melancholy Order, in which he demonstrates how technology has always been present in the global mobility regime since the 19th century. So the point is, what do we mean by technology, and not to conflate technology with the high tech, and not to study only the most, let's say, advanced forms of technology, such as artificial intelligence. So the first part of the paper try to conceptualize harm beyond surveillance, and in order to do that, it starts from some methodological point about, of course, avoiding the romanticization of migrants and migrant struggles. So the point of seeing digital technology like migrants is not to romanticize how migrants live their lives with technology or against technology, but to pay attention to which kind of claims do they raise. And also the more silent struggles that consist in how they navigate the system for tactically appropriate some of these technology to their advantage. Anthropologist Sharam Khoshravis, in one of his papers, asks, what do we see if we look at the border from the other side? And in doing so, he advocates for a way of seeing which avoid falling into the traps of methodological nationalism, that is, of reproducing concepts and epistemologies used by the state. So I think that this is a very important methodological point for addressing this problem of how not to reproduce even in an involuntary way the state's discourse on digital technology in refugee governance, or the discourse crafted by humanitarian organization that is mainly driven by problem-solving approach. So how to implement technology without affecting migrants too much, or how to implement technology in a way that we can govern migration in a fairer and better way. So similarly, we shall ask, what do we see if we think about the arms of technology from migrants' perspective? So raising this question, by raising this question, I caution against the risk of fetishism, the fetishization of technology, which is at play in part in academic research about the digitalization of refugee humanitarianism. So what I call the techno-hype that pervades debates about the technologization of migration governmentality overemphasize the use of technology in refugee camps, as well as at the border, without sufficiently scrutinizing how and the extent to which these are deployed on the ground, to what extent they are deployed, but also how they work, and also the many times when this technology do not work because there are technical glitches or because there are controversies among different actors. So in the paper, I focus on the Greek context, which is one of my main research sites at the moment, because I think that Greece represents nowadays a quite interesting case studies for a couple of reasons. The first one is that Greece, since 2015, with the so-called refugee crisis, has become one of these places where, more than in other European countries, the role of external actors, for instance, international organizations, more than local NGOs, have become so central. And for instance, I have in mind clear comparison with Italy, where the government of migration is mainly under, the purview of the Italian state, of the Italian government, and of national NGOs. So there is definitely this central role played by international organization, international NGOs, and also, for instance, the European Agency of Asylum, EASO, has been definitely much more important for the very functioning of the asylum system in Italy than, in Greece than not in Italy. So there is this partial exceptional character of Greece, because Greece received, as probably most of you know, a lot of money from the European Commission at the time. At the same time, I think that there has been this tendency of depicting Greece as this terrain of experimentation, a bit like Jordan, of techno-humanitarianism. And instead, what I've done in my work is to show how this implementation of new technology, or for instance, the implementation of the cash assistance program, the first program of cash assistance funded by the European Commission in Europe in 2016, actually goes together with a series of non-digital trends. So that Greece is a place where all these tendency goes together. So the partial digitalization of asylum, but also a return to the non-digital. And this is the case in particular today. Since November 2021, many of the technologies that were before, until then, used in the daily functioning of asylum had been scrapped. For instance, the use of the Skype system to pre-book an appointment with the asylum service to lodge asylum application has come to an end. And however, these I don't think we can evaluate in this moment if it's good or bad. This is actually in part also the result of mobilization against the Skype system, but on the other is part of a broader reform of the asylum that goes in the direction of let's say carceral police management of asylum seekers. In this moment, migrants who arrive on the Greek mainland can apply for asylum only at the police station with the risk of being detained and put in jail. And they are the only places where they can claim asylum are on the island, apart from police station on the mainland, in these closed camps. So it's not a question of judging if it's good or bad, that there are more or less technologies. However, so why apart from this, why the Greek context is helpful for this argument of technology of expulsion? So since 2015, a series of low-tech, I would say, technology and apps have been progressively introduced in the asylum procedure, and these have become obstacles for the migrants who wanted to claim asylum or wanted to, for instance, get financial or humanitarian support. So the first of these, as I just mentioned, is the Skype mandatory system. So migrants could apply for asylum only by booking their appointment via Skype, and this led to a lot of problems, like difficulties in because of people who didn't have internet connectivity, because of like the Skype number that was constantly busy. So many migrants took also like weeks before they could be able to apply for asylum in specific time slots, depending on their nationality and their language. But also there have been a series of, as I explained in the paper, other apps, for instance, Viber and WhatsApp, that were the only digital channels allowed that migrants could use for speaking with humanitarian actors if they had problems, for instance, with their prepaid cards, or for receiving updates from the government about the asylum procedure. So in this sense, the claims raised by asylum seekers was not about we are scared of being tracked or that our data is collected, but was about the Skype system is a further obstacle. The access to the financial support is so difficult, and is also based on this mix of technological barriers, digital barriers, and disciplinary mechanisms. So for instance, migrants could reach UNHCR only via Viber, but if they sent more than one message per time, their message automatically went at the bottom of the queue, just to punish them. The second part of the paper tried to engage with the literature on carcerality and carceral geography, and is entitled Choking Without Immobilizing, Rethinking Refugee Carcerality. And in this part, I mainly engage with the work of feminist scholar Jasbir Puar, and in particular her book on the right to maim, that is not about migration at all, is about the Palestinian context. But I find very relevant what she argues about a shift from biopolitics in the sense of making live, letting die, towards modes of biopolitical modes that weaponize the determination and capacity not to die, so to debilitate people and to harm and to choke, to use another term, and to produce these forms of mobility impairment more than killing or letting people die. And for me, it is an interesting starting point for thinking how shall we conceive carceral mechanism in a context where, in part, we are confronted with these digital borders and digitalization of asylum procedure and border controls, and on the other, with actual carceral spaces. So, for instance, in Greece, there is a multiplication of physical carceral spaces at the moment, and not only in Greece, both at sea and on the mainland. So at sea, migrants who have been kidnapped on the boat, or migrants who are kept in state of detention or semi-detention. So I think that without, of course, dismissing the actual detention of migrants, I think that is interesting to see this heterogeneity of carceral mode, and the fact that migrants' lives are choked also by being stolen of their time, by being delayed in a state of protected uncertainty, and by being expelled within, as long as they are isolated, taken far away from urban centers. There is spatial and temporal carcerality is not enforced only through fences, nor through system for monitoring and surveilling at a distance. In this respect, the Greek asylum system constitutes a case in point for observing how carceral mechanisms are enacted also beyond surveillance and through blatant biopolitical tactics, after choking migrant lives more than killing or letting them die. On the Greek island in particular, migrants are affected by what can be called a twofold confinement. They are entrapped in an enforcement archipelago, and simultaneously they are subjected to harsh and uneven mobility restriction, in particular since the start of COVID-19. And I'm happy to say something more in the Q&A about what happened during COVID-19 and the series of decrees that have been enforced in Greece to restrict refugees' mobility in the name of COVID-19. I think it's interesting to articulate this geography of differential confinement. So the key role played by geography, how geography was used to differentiate the exclusionary access to asylum, so really using the island or some points as legitimate points or places where migrants could claim asylum and others where they are not, and these technologies of expulsion. So to conclude, an insight into migrant struggle and claims reveals the multiplication of techno-bureaucratic hurdles that migrants encounter to claim asylum, the disruption and delays in receiving the monthly financial support, and the digital barriers they face for renewing the permit to stay. Challenging the techno-fetishism in refugee humanitarianism helps in also moving beyond this exclusive focus on surveillance. On the one hand, such a focus on the partial technologization of refugee humanitarianism pushes us to reconceptualize carceral mechanisms beyond immobilization, detention, and surveillance. On the other, the multiple and repeated technological obstruction affect migrant subjectivity and shape them. Asylum seekers are in fact turned into forced techno users, so that they are obliged to use these also low-tech technology and apps for be in touch, for instance, with a humanitarian organization. Such a focus, however, does not involve sidelining the actual and potential use of technology in refugee governmentality for strengthening surveillance. Rather, I think that it's key to interrogate which harms are produced on the people who claim asylum, drawing attention in particular to their claim and to their struggles. And this entails, as I said, shifting away from a citizen gaze, which replicates concern about privacy, data extraction, and informed consent as the main risk associated to the use of digital technologies. So analyzing technology of expulsion and carceral mechanisms jointly, it emerged that a critique of border violence should scrutinize how those who are labeled and governed as migrants and as asylum seekers are armed, choked, and robbed of their lifetime. And yeah, as a really last note, for me in this moment, and this is part of the other paper, is very important to investigate this. So what does it mean methodologically to investigate the assemblage of digital and non-digital technologies, and how the digital also affects the way in which the non-digital persist in asylum bureaucracy? I would stop here.
Thanks very much, Martina. That was a very helpful both introduction to your broader work, drawing on other work that you have done and you are currently doing, but also specifically the case studies that you mentioned in this particular paper. And as you stated, Greece is a significant site or frontier of contestation at the moment for the changing governmentality of border regimes. European Union itself, but also member states have been increasingly moving from an enabling capacity as liberal states to increasingly punishing those who cross borders. So there is definitely a changing regime, as it were, toward migrants, rather than member states considering themselves as particularly states that have rights towards those who cross borders, however they are defined, migrants or refugees, increasingly see themselves as border control apparatuses. Your point about the technologies, I think captures a significant element of this. What you call fetishization of technology in some ways masks this particular change, and your shift of focus from considering technologies, especially fetishizing discourses that focus on enabling aspect of technologies, tend to not see that disabling or what you call harming aspects of technology. And I really welcome that change of focus to expand the repertoire of how migration and border regimes are being governed. I have a number of questions, but I'm going to hold them for now to open up for the floor, and I might come back to a couple of those, at least, of my questions. Again, thanks very much for your great overview and introduction to the work that you shared with us. The floor is open, and I've given you a little bit of time to think about questions. Do we have any questions? Bene, I think you have one. I'm going to turn my mic off because Bene is here, and so that Bene can turn her mic on. Is not working? You can come in here. It's 2 steps, and you can ask the question here.
You want me to go here?
Yeah.
Okay.
We could use our spatial.
Absolutely. Hubert, okay. Is there?
Yep, the mic is on.
Okay. Hi, Martina. Hi, everyone from this side. First of all, thank you so much for such a brilliant presentation. I am a great reader of your work, and I was really excited to read the paper. I have 2 questions. So one is a question, and one is more a curiosity. The first question regards how this idea of technology of expulsion can be also entangled with an idea of technologies of escapes. So thinking about your last book about the making of migration and rethinking about migration as both connected to form of objectivation and subjectivation. So the idea that is both constituted and created, but also enacted by migrants themselves. I was thinking whether there could be also space of thinking on how technology will impact the way in which migrants think of themselves and kind of organize their escapes. And I can make some examples. So my field work would be on the border between Bosnia and Croatia. And a lot of people that I've talked to, they use TikTok, they use social media. They also use Google Maps. And I recently actually heard of this new app that they're using on the dark web to track drones in order to avoid police deportations. So there is a discussion of technology also entering the way in which migrants are escaping from these same technologies of expulsion. So I wonder if you think that there could be also space of discussing that. And the second point would be, I mean, you kind of touched on it, on how on carcerality and on how COVID-19 has changed it. And again, I make the example of Bosnia, in which basically on the border between Bosnia and Croatia, so in Bihac, a lot of temporary reception centers that were opened by the International Organization of Migration have closed after the pandemic. And in the beginning, during the lockdowns, migrants were incarcerated because of quarantine measures. Then what happened is that they were prohibited to go around in the urban centers. And then what happened is that even after the lockdown, these policies stayed in place, and they're still in place now, so that it's legal for the police or even the citizen to report migrants around, and they're all deported in the camps that are now isolated in the mountain. So I was actually curious if that's the same case in Greece, and if you wanted to expand a bit about that as well. Thank you. Go back to my place. Yes.
Thank you. Shall I answer now, or shall we collect some questions?
What do you prefer? I think it would be good to respond to this because she outlined 2 questions.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the 2 questions, the question and the comment. So the technology of escape, yeah, I fully agree with you, and this is something that I explore more in detail in the book. And there are many authors actually also, in particular in the field of media studies, who explore this possibility of like there's all this analysis on the digital passage, how migrants use technology for making their own way to Europe and also for dodging control. And so definitely, let's say that in this paper, I was more interested in seeing how, so in conceptualizing, in paying attention to migrant struggles in relation to the technology that are that they need to use, right? So that this kind of like forced digital intermediation between them and the humanitarian actors. So what is happening in particular in the field of, so as long as they enter the asylum procedure, definitely technology of escape. There are, migrants make use of technology for crossing borders. My only, maybe what I can add to that is that, so as I said, and you, of course, you know as well, all this literature on the tactical use of technology at sea and on the mainland. However, even here, in order not to reproduce again the techno hype, I think is important to be aware that, of course, migrants do use technology. They use Google Maps, as you said. They use the other maps. Mia is called the one that where you can download the map when you don't have then the signal. So, you, for instance, on the Alps, they use this kind of app to cross. But again, as we all also use technology, so it is important, in my view, not to essentialize or make this special gaze for migrants. So, well, they also use technology. Yes, they do, and they also use in a tactical way. So this is. And about COVID-19, so and again, and another point on technology of escape, I think that is interesting how even in the field of asylum, they try to find like the leeway for instance, for getting the monthly financial support twice. Now, finding like technical glitches in the system, because there were, in particular at the beginning, there was no communication between the different databases of the different refugee camps in 2017. So there were asylum seekers who were able to get financial support in one camp and then move to another camp when the UNHCR was delivering the card and get a second one. About COVID-19, yes, definitely. I mean, I didn't know the details of the Bosnia-Croatian border. In Greece, what happened is that in a quite invisible way, apart from the most blatant thing has been this differential lockdown system, so that refugees has been subjected to lockdown in camps for more months than the others, than Greek citizens and the other people resident in the country. So this carceral, this form of carceral confinement, strictly speaking. But apart from that, if I well understood that you are asking me about like measures that still remain in place. And indeed, there have been many decrees enforced that determine the restriction that asylum seekers are subjected to in the name of COVID-19. For instance, the possibility of like arresting asylum seekers if they represent a threat to public health. And a series of geographical restrictions, as I said, about the mobility from the camp to the city. For instance, on the island of Lesbos, migrants are allowed to go out only twice per week now, and this has been enforced in the name of COVID-19. And I think that most of these will remain in place for a long time.
Thanks, Martina, and thanks, Bene, for your questions. Any other questions from the floor or from the audience? Audrey.
Hi. I'm going to just leave my camera off for the moment, if that's okay.
Sure, we can hear you clearly.
Good, thank you. I didn't have the opportunity to see your paper, Martina, but I thought it was a wonderful presentation. And I wanted to ask a question that's really, I think, just clarification of one of the points you're making. And I'll just pause by relating this to something that I know a little bit about on this side, with, in Canada, which is quite a, in many ways seems like a different situation. But here's my analogy. The government introduced a new online portal for refugee claimants to apply for protection. And it's digitized and blah, blah, blah. It's supposed to be more efficient. One of the ways in which it is designed was to effectively preclude lawyers from being able to work with their clients effectively to do this, and putting the burden on claimants to do it themselves, which obviously makes the whole process less accessible. In addition to that, the portal just collapsed a lot. Relating it back to what you're talking about, one of the thoughts I had in terms of this techno-fetishism, and I wonder if this is a point you're making, is that they operate not just through succeeding on their own terms, but through their own failure. That is, their failure to work. I mean, what I understood you describing as the harms visited on migrants themselves is not that they worked, but that they didn't work, right? And that just adds more suffering. And there is a whole, and as you said, that's not a new thing about technologies, right? There's a whole kind of, law and society kind of literature on what's called process as punishment, where you erect a process that is so, in fact, inaccessible or slow or ineffectual that it becomes its own harm. And so I wondered if I've captured the point that you were making about the harms of technology, which is not just that they work on their own terms, but that they fail on their own terms.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect summary. I agree with you. It doesn't exactly, they work in the sense that they ended up in disrupting access to asylum. And I think that this is really kind of deliberate strategy enforced by the Greek authorities, but importantly with the pressure and support of European actors from many point of view, not only through technology, also from a legal point of view. For instance, there has been, in June 2021, Turkey has been defined a safe country. So which means as a result of that, migrants from 5 nationalities, from Bangladesh, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Somalia, they might be declared non-eligible for asylum. So they are preventively legalized, for instance. And this, of course, against any law. So there is a complex infrastructure of for preventing migrants to become asylum seekers, and even more for becoming refugees. And technology is part of this. So the fact of disrupting access, making it more difficult, and the fact that these technologies do not work, or I agree, is part of the harm. So when I say these hurdles, these obstacles, is precisely, for me, this is a crucial point, that how now the access to the procedure itself, and even more to the protection, the international protection, is becoming so hard because of this mix of legal, spatial, and technological tactics. So yes, absolutely. And related to that, I also like your other point about Canada, so that some of these technologies or digital interfaces were in place before, not for migrants, no, if I understood correctly, but also for citizens. And this is another point that I forgot to say in the presentation, that for me is very important, because now there is, there are many papers who speak about, that and that country as a testing ground, where migrants become like this object of experimentation, where technologies are tested, and then this might be exported elsewhere. And I think this metaphor is kind of problematic for the reason you said, so that in the end, if we trace a genealogy of where some of these technologies are, not only where they were born, but also how they were used at the level of welfare system or control, we see that the beginning is now with migrants. For instance, in Jordan, this famous use of iris scan in refugee camps that everyone is interested in, didn't start with refugees. So this bank, Amman Cairo Bank, used this technology with Jordanian clients. and the same with finger veins. So that is not really true that is a laboratory of experimentation, and also that, to be honest, in particular in relation to Greece, I couldn't see. So there's been this bombastic analysis about, okay, artificial intelligence everywhere in camps. It seems that this laboratory, and then you see that even these new camps, while there are many fences, this is true, but now asylum seekers in some of these camps need to swipe their cards to get in and out, and so the authorities can basically monitor entry and exit. But another thing is to say, well, there is artificial intelligence everywhere. So
thank you so much, and that was really rich, and I really appreciate your response as well. And it, as an aside, the report, that argument from Canada is something I'm quite familiar. I'm sure you know Petra Molnar has been working a lot on this, and I'm quite familiar with the report. She worked with us on that. So thank you. And I take your point about the perhaps overstating the laboratory point, and I want to go back and think more about that. Anyway, thank you very much. That was great.
Thank you, Audrey. Antje.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Hi, Martina. Nice to see you again. Thank you. I really enjoyed the presentation. I also really appreciate, especially your return in a way to the non-digital, or your kind of intervention into the techno hype. And I would actually like to read the other paper when that's out. Or I don't know if you can say a little bit about this now. Obviously, you don't want to give two papers, but I think that's really interesting intervention as well. Having said that, I do have a question about just something I was wondering about the role of digital media, and then a question after that, if I may. So I was wondering, when you were talking, we know, as you were saying, from media scholarship, the importance of mobile phones for migrants as they plan their routes and on their routes, and in terms of communicating transnationally with people at home and so on and so forth. But then we also know from other research in media scholarship that social media data is actually used by police for predictive policing, for example, in the context of protests, and not just surveying activists, but actually leading to incarcerations in some cases. So I was wondering if that's something you looked at all, or if you came across this in your research. And then the other question I was just really interested in is really more of a political question, which is, you were talking a little bit about, or you were mentioning briefly at the beginning, opportunities for resistance and migrants' agency in negotiating these technologies of repulsion. So I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that, and if you found in your fieldwork any forms maybe of technological resistance of any form against these and other forms of expulsion.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So in relation to the first point, no, the answer is very clear, is no. I'm not doing any work on predictive policing, but maybe this is related more to Benedetta's point on technology of escape, but part of, I'm interested in how these technologies is tactically used not only by migrants, but also by activists, for instance, activist networks, and the criminalization of activist networks that are using, because of their use of technology. So precisely along the Balkan route, for instance, border violence monitoring, this group of activists has been in trouble also because of their tactical use of some apps for reporting to the police on the one hand where migrants were located, so to basically visibilize migrants in order to prevent that they could be pushed back. No, but this has been turned against them, because initially the police was like, okay, they show us the location, so we have the duty to go and rescue the person and allow the person to apply for asylum in the country. We cannot push them back. But after a while, given the anti-immigrant sentiments at the moment, so they were not in trouble in just using this digital information for going there, say, okay, we know where the migrants is, and pushing the migrants back. so helping the police. And they decide, okay, we need to stop using this app because it might be turned against us. For instance, about example of resistance. Yeah, so these the struggles that I observe, in particular in Greece, for me, what is interesting is that, as I said, they are nothing to do with like surveillance or with the risk of being controlled or monitored, or even of being tracked, because of course they know. The point is that as long as they land in Greece, they are fingerprinted. So they know that this is the real technological trap. So since then, their presence in Europe is marked, right? So it doesn't matter if then they are also tracked within the country, no? So all these protests were more centered around either we don't want this technological intermediation like with the Skype system. And this was a quite strong protest that went on for more than 1 month and in 2018, but then was repeated in time. And the other was about the cash assistance, so that their point was, now we are scared because through the card. So there have been, I also investigated, right? Does UNHCR use the card to track migrants? Because this is one of the questions that might come to our mind, okay, financial transaction. And then the concern of the refugees was how can we get the financial support in time? Because most of them were excluded. So the card was, the struggle over the card was a struggle for getting the card and getting the payment, no? And well, most of the tactics of like appropriation were through forms of like non-digital resistance. For instance, selling their own cards while people were detained in the hotspot because of the lockdown, selling their cars to people across the fences, so in order to get some money. So that it is in the end more than digital resistance, let's say. And then you asked me another question, but now I forgot. The third question was, I think you asked me a third one.
Sorry, yeah, I mean, I think it was generally a point on resistance, but actually something you mentioned, something I forgot to ask, which is the role of maybe NGOs in resisting these kind of, or activists in resisting these kind of technologies, or the ways in which maybe NGOs or activists are appropriated by actors using technologies of expulsion against migrants. I think that's something else I've been wondering.
Well, NGO, it depends which NGOs, because NGOs, some of these NGOs in Greece do collaborate with the UNHCR. Well, the cash assistance program came to an end in September this year. So now, after 3 months of nothing, they have cards again, sponsored by the Greek government. But until September, so 2 NGOs, Caritas, Hellas, and the International Federation of the Red Cross were in charge of delivering the cards on behalf of UNHCR, so they were not trying to dodge any. Other NGOs, now, to be honest, I mean, of course, there have been, for instance, NGOs more like solidarity networks that have used, that have put in place apps, right, for providing information about safe shelters, or also where they could find legal aid and medical aid, like also, for instance, and the mobile info point network. But these are just basic thing. Again, it's not through it's just alongside other non-digital tactics that is really not the main concern, right? Also of NGOs that help migrants. But it's true that at some point, now it's becoming less, but at some point it became these huge technological barriers. And so claiming asylum was like mediated by these technological barriers. And so many NGOs were claiming, of course, they were supporting refugees in their claim against the Skype system, for instance.
Thanks, Martina. Thanks, Antje. I think we have Raphael next with a question.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Hi Martina, nice to meet you. Thanks very much. The presentation was extremely fascinating, very nuanced in the details. So thanks very much, and thanks to the colleagues here at Queen Mary for hosting me. I would like to ask you a question about what we now call internal borders. The experience of borders by migrants, not at the borderland, but more in the inland, if you wish. I think this resonates a lot with what you were saying about expulsion. So the fact that expulsion is also exclusion from rights and from asylum. So my question is, how do you see what is the role of technologies in producing, but also in contesting internal borders, so beyond the borderland? For example, when it comes to access to health, education, and also the relationship with policing. I think this is also important especially for those migrants that now it's a very relevant phenomenon. Now we have there is a lot of people that are, in a long limbo, now settled in European towns and cities, for example, waiting for the outcome of their application, or they have been denied asylum but are still residing in cities and towns. Just to give you a little bit of context, I'm investigating this topic with a colleague here at Queen Mary, Rachel Humphries. We are starting from the case of sanctuary cities, especially in the US, where the use of technologies, especially digital technologies, are quite making sanctuary cities obsolete as a struggle and as a process. For example, because immigrants are afraid of accessing services because of the interoperability of data across units. So this is the starting point we are investigating. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree. Even if my research is mainly focused on so-called border zone, but what you said is also related to the reason why I decided not to focus on what happens at the border. So the biometric technology is implemented when migrants enter the territory, but what happens after? So after also that after the registration and the first police identification that many scholars investigated, not because it's not interesting, but also because I think it's important, as you also mentioned, to, if I understood your point, to stretch the very notion of the border in the sense of when does the border impact on migrant lives, which kind of different borders, and the borders of asylum and the impossibility to access the asylum procedure is also the impossibility of getting access to basic rights and to the authorization to stay and to education. Because of course, if you are immediately turned into an illegal migrant, you don't have access to any of these rights. And this is what many people in Greece experience. For instance, during COVID-19, there has been a problem of this renewal of the asylum card because of COVID. But then, so the offices were closed because of COVID-19 and the lockdown, so they couldn't renew their asylum card. But at the same time, the procedure went on, so that they were turned into illegal migrants because they couldn't prove that their asylum card was renewed or expired, but they couldn't renew, and so they immediately lost access to rights. So this is the first thing, that for me the borders of asylum are also like the starting point of like getting access to a series of rights, and so this is again is not only the moment of when migrants lodge the asylum application, but what happens while they wait, and they have to access the health system, or to open, for instance, a bank account. This is I mentioned this because these are like the criteria also for eventually getting access to accommodation after they get the refugee status, if they get the refugee status, through a program sponsored by IOM called Helios. But I think it's super interesting what you're doing. I'm not working on, let's say, the urban context as such. And I think this is much more unexplored than indeed what is happening, like this technology deployed at the border.
Thanks very much, Martina.
Actually, just a quick addition to Raphael's question. In response to, I think, earlier question, you were saying that, migrants, once their fingerprints are taken, they're marked in the territory, and really they don't worry about being tracked or not. But I think with the supplement of Raphael's questions, that conclusion might be thought about critically, because migrants are marked differently in different stages of their incorporation or assimilation in a place. So fingerprint maybe marks entry-exit point, but state authorities are very much interested in continually marking them, therefore tracking because of internal borders. And it's where internal borders also are concerned, the domestic and the international begin to lose their specificity. The technologies that are used for international subjects, as it were, are used domestically, and technologies that are used for domestic subjects are used for international subjects. So you see the technology transfer taking place between, let's say, welfare system, unemployment system, human resources, and health system into migration system, asylum system, and then the cross-reference between the two. And yes, technologies fail, but also the vision of the system, if you like, is one smoothless apparatus where subjects can be tracked throughout the course and stages of their lives and in their movement. Of course, it doesn't reach there, it fails, but in the failures, it generates all sorts of tracking systems and resistances to them. So I think the Raphael question is a really nice opening also to, like you said, you're not focusing on this, but it would be good to see studies that also look at internal borders and a conversation, the kind of conversation you're initiating between, let's say, governmentality and resistance studies can also be done in international borders and internal borders. That would be interesting collaboration and cooperation. I think Jeff is, unless either Raphael or you would like to say something, I would like to give floor to Jeff. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Engin. Thank you, Martina, for a fascinating paper. I've got two things, just reflections, two small ones. I know they're not small ones, they're conceptual ones. One is where you started off by saying, which I really like, this move, say that technology and the focus on technology is overshadowing the critique of border regimes. So we just had a bit of discussion about where borders are and how they move and so on. But I'm wondering, because you actually made another move as well, I think, and I'm wondering if the focus on borders and border regimes is not overshadowing a focus on carcerality and incarceration. So what would happen if you let go of the concept of borders to really start looking at the mechanisms of incarceration, which then would allow you not to have to deal, it might have all kinds of consequences that migrants are not from the outside, not from the inside, but that you're actually focusing on a much more fluid mechanisms of control through incarceration, which I liked really well what you did in how you actually dealt with that. The second question I have, can you hear me, Martina? Because you're frozen on my screen. Is that on my side only?
Oh, 1 second, because I have a problem with the laptop. 1 second, their charger. Can you see me?
We are able to hear you, Martina, but we can't see your video.
1 second, I will try to switch the camera again.
Okay.
Now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Good. Now I can see. Yeah. I was just wondering if you heard as well.
Yeah, I heard everything.
Otherwise, I'm talking to myself and to all the other people. But the second one is about, I like that as well. It's a different question. It's about seeing like a migrant, where you then say we see like a migrant, and then you go focusing on the question of how they see or experience and so on harm, and take that as the entry point. I think that's a change. But there is also something I sometimes wonder is that seeing like a migrant is still a seeing that focuses on the mechanisms of control, right? So, but there is an element as well. A question I have is, that is fine, and this is not critique of such an analysis, but it reproduces therefore a particular understanding of how control functions and so on, and puts the migrant in a position of always the one under control. Now, some people then do, of course, there's resistance and then we are in control. But somehow there are also elements, I assume, that if you see like a migrant, not like James Scott seeing, but the seeing of the migrant as what they experience, that you can have an analysis of harm and control, but not in the sense that control and harm become necessarily the single focal point. So that you also already, when you would open and how we would do that, to build in that migrants build their life under all these conditions as well, not to romanticize and say this is nice and so on. It's not necessarily very nice at all, but as a way of actually letting go of this continuous looking through the lens of control as the organizing device for understanding who a migrant is, how they appear, and so on, also in our analysis. So I'd like to hear your ideas if you have any. I know you have some about this, but to hear some about whether that's a useful thing to explore or how to do it and so on. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jeff. So regarding the first question, this is, despite the title of the book, which is Border Abolition, it might look like, okay, there is a full focus on borders. I'm taking it, let me know if I'm speaking too much, but is related to some extent. So the reason why I'm interested in abolitionist literature is not because the point is not abolish borders, right? So that the title doesn't want to say let's abolish border, but how abolitionist literature allows us to look at the problems of border within a broader framework of what Angela Davis called abolition democracy, and building on Du Bois. So the fact that it's not enough to focus on the border and which borders, given that, as you said, as Engin said, which internal or external borders, but to start to look at the question of migration and migration governance differently in terms of constituent process. So I fully agree that there is in the literature, and in particular all this debate on no borders, open borders, this obsession with the border, so this reification of the border, both the national frontiers and other kind of borders as the problem. At the same time, what I wanted to say in that paper is more that a critique of the mechanism, let's say legal, political and administrative mechanisms by which some people are not granted the access to asylum, for instance, or are racialized as migrants, and are politically defined as migrants, shouldn't. I think it's still important to interrogate ourselves. How do we elaborate a critique of all this? Then we can avoid the term borders and say administrative mechanism, laws and policies, whatever. But the point is that for me, what differentiates some subject and make them sometimes even independently of their actual legal status as part of these hierarchies, right, of humanities is still important because it affects people's lives, both from a juridical point of view and at the level of their or our, whatever, his experience. So the critique of borders, I didn't frame it correctly. I didn't mean just the critique of the national frontiers. And I agree with you that, yeah, I take the point about like shifting towards carceral mechanism. For me, the two things are not mutually exclusive, because a carceral mechanism, there is also the specificity of what it means to be governed as a migrant, and this still counts on people's lives. And on seeing like a migrant, yeah, again, yes, I agree with the point. I fully understand the point of moving beyond this logic or perspective focus on control, and the solution is not just to reverse the gaze and to say, okay, how do migrants feel control? I think that for me, and I agree, migrants see and have to say much more than just how they are controlled by the state. But this is also one of the points. So reason why I'm saying, if we interrogate, if we pay attention to what migrants say or how do they act in relation to this technology, what we see is not fundamentally, the primary thing is not control. Is not how do they feel affected in terms of being controlled, but also in terms of how their lives are disrupted and taken hostage of, in this case, of humanitarian actors. And I think that the moment of the asylum procedure, and that sometimes lasts for years, is really a moment when many people lose control of their lives, no? As Sharam Khosravi said, their time has been stolen. So I think we should also recognize the specificity. I don't know if I...
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Martina. Thanks, Jeff. So I want to come back to a question that I wanted to ask. It's half comment and also comes wrapped in a question, or maybe the other way around. It is a comment, but it comes as wrapped in something else. Let me just try to express it. I am not sure, as I read your paper and listened to your presentation, I am not sure if the title is right for the paper, if the concept is actually matching the argument that you're presenting. So technology's expulsion would mean either forcible or indirect removal of people from one particular territory to another. Displaced movement, forced movement are other categories. And we, of course, know that that technology existed for a long, long time, coeval with the states. The states have invented the technology of expulsion of undesirables, unwanted people, unwelcome people, unfit people, and so on, with various categories. With the concept of carcerality, and particularly your focus on harm, disruption, and general unease into which migrants and asylum seekers, refugees have been put, there is something more sinister than expulsion that's happening in your description. What is sinister about it is, particularly when you described your point of inspiration from Palestine, where the point is not actually to expulse, it's not forced displacement, but work through the resilience of people to survive, to maintain ongoing cruelty on them. So this a mechanism of ongoing cruelty to the point of breaking of resilience, but not quite, seems to be objective of this particular form of power that you're trying to describe with the concept technology of expulsion. But if this is the case, if I'm reading your empirical illustration, and if I'm drawing the right conclusion, then these are not technologies of expulsion. And I think the term is not really doing service to the richness you're capturing. I'm wondering if the state authorities and international authorities who are engaged in and charged with migration, governing migration and governing migrant movements, in this case, whether they're interested with the harms and disruptions they cause to actually eliminate them from the territory, but maintain a continuing presence under cruel conditions. On the one hand, achieving an aim for a theater of cruelty for everyone to say, when and if you attempt to do what these people have done, this is the kind of life that's waiting you. That means formalization of regime of hostility, but with this technology is happening. And I think this is actually much more sinister to be named than technology of expulsion. What do you think?
Yes, even if now there is an in particular about the UK literature on migration and cruelty, that however I don't know if the term cruelty captures. For me, cruelty is too much, maybe because I'm not a native speaker, so I might not get the nuances of the term, but it evokes me too much like intentionality and deliberate tactics of enacting this cruelty. While in this case, for me, is more, I mean, I might be wrong, is more what I can get from the fieldwork, is a mix of like indifference, willingness of, to some extent, exploit people from an economic point of view, but at the same time keeping them outside of the access to rights and protection. So that is true. In other papers, I use a lot this, and also in my book, choking and disruption, and we can also call it technology of choking and disrupting life or stealing life. I agree that it does more than that. But expulsion, I don't mean, as I said, expulsion from the territory, because it's not, I didn't say technology of exclusion indeed, but it's more expulsion from the possibility to get access to welfare rights and asylum. That is also a response that states are given to this populist concern about, okay, if migrants get access to rights, I have less right as a citizen, no? This crazy perverse logic, this destructive logic. So the response is, okay, let's keep them out of accommodation, asylum, and a series. So I agree that there is also this biopolitics at stake. I don't know if I have to think about if I would name it cruelty, because I don't see these necessarily at stake, or in particular cruelty means that there is an actor that acts according to this. Is a mix of not preventively avoiding that, making them invisible, right? Also at the level, on a public level, even if they are there, and in case also exploit them. Definitely we can, I have to clarify that expulsion is not expulsion from the territory, and is not even exclusion. But it's probably something in between cruelty and expulsion, which is about suffocating, making their lives impossible. This is what I like of Jasbir Puar.
Yeah. Well, I think it's worth thinking about whether there's another concept that is trying to be born here to describe these expulsion. Of course, you're right. It's not only in terms of territorial expulsion, but also it has come to define that as a word, as a technology. So that's why I wanted to mention that.
Yeah. No, I agree. The difference, I like Jasbir Puar a lot, this idea of like harming and debilitating, but still she doesn't. So there is a specificity of the refugee context that is about like non-citizen or people who are not only non-citizen, but whose presence is considered unauthorized in the territory. And I think this still makes a difference. We cannot forget that there is this element that, and again, it's not about removal necessarily, it's about that, but it's not only about removal from the territory, but how this harm is enacted is also by hampering them from getting access to these basic rights.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's something to think about how these practices also have become normalized. I mean, the great value of your work is to give us the language and also the vista to look at these myriad practices that are much more complicated than enacting border regimes, included, excluded, but rapidly changing management of people's movement and then their access to rights. So we are facing a really complex situation. On that note, and 1 minute late, I think I'm going to bring our discussion to a close. Unless there is really an urgent question, of course, I would give the floor to an urgent question. Otherwise, I just want to thank Martina for her sharing her wonderful chapter, yet unpublished, as well as the overview and the presentation, as well as the responses to questions. So we really, really appreciate your participation, Martina, and thanks so much, and good luck with your work. Of course, we are closely following.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation and for the debate, for the question.
See you again.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.